poet Geoffrey Chaucer lived through a period of profound change. The late 1300s was an age of transition that saw the decline of the traditional feudal system and the emergence of a new social hierarchy in an increasingly mercantile England. Despite these major changes, the power of the Catholic Church still prevailed, although, as the Canterbury Tales suggest, it was an institution riddled with corruption.
In 1349, England was ravaged by the Black Death, which killed 1/3 of the population. Abroad, English foreign policy had embroiled the country in the 100 Years' War. Punitive taxation, imposed to meet the cost of war, was the driving force behind the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Despite this social upheaval, the age was one of great opportunity. Chaucer, the son of a wealthy London wine merchant, was born into the burgeoning middle class. His father's connections at court secured Chaucer a position in the service of the Countess of Ulster. She introduced him to the royal patronage he was to enjoy for most of his life. His varied duties ranged from diplomatic missions to clerk of the king's works.
It was this wealth of experience which provided the material for the poetry and prose that brought Chaucer literary eminence in his lifetime. His intellectual imagination was shaped by English culture and language, and also that of France and Italy. Chaucer wrote only in English, although in order to reflect his literary influences, his writing has been categorized into French, Italian, and English periods. An extensive literary range, together with his observation of the human condition, shaped Chaucer's writing. His rich poetic vocabulary and broad social vision were combined to maximum effect in his most celebrated work, the Canterbury Tales.
Chaucer was a middle-class man who made good. He was the son of a wine merchant who got himself to court through marriage. He married one of the ladies-in-waiting at the court. As a result of that, he became very pampered, very loved by royalty. He got sent on diplomatic missions abroad, and he ended up as a civil servant. He was a customs official for the last 25 years of his life.
Chaucer began writing the Canterbury Tales in about 1387, during a period of semi-retirement. It was an ambitious undertaking. He planned to explore a wide range of narrative genre, using as a framing narrative a pilgrimage to Canterbury. A disparate group of 29 pilgrims meet at the Tabard Inn at Southwark, where the pilgrim narrator is admitted to their number.
In Southwark, at the Tabard, as I lay, ready to wenden on my pilgrimage, to Canterbury, with full devout courage, at night was come into that hostelry, well 29, in a company of sundry folk. By adventuri falla in fellowship, and pilgrims were they alle, that toward Canterbury wolden reade.
Chaucer's original plan was that each pilgrim would tell 4 tales, 2 on the road to Canterbury and 2 on the return journey to London. This major project was never fully realized, and what was written was not finally revised. However, the 24 tales found after Chaucer's death were an immediate success. The success was not just because of his narrative skill, but also because of the imaginative force of Chaucer's original idea. From this great poem, 10 manuscript fragments survive, although it is not known exactly in which order the tales were written or how Chaucer intended the fragments to be read.
It's hard to have a clear idea of the order which Chaucer finally intended the tales to go in, because Chaucer actually left the Canterbury Tales unfinished and unrevised. So we don't have a complete text. What we have are manuscript fragments, and sometimes those fragments contain 1 tale, sometimes they actually contain 3 or 4 tales. So within the fragments we can be sure about order on a small scale, but we don't know the order in which the fragments were intended to come.
What we do know is that there are certain chunks that fit together. For example, after the Knight's Tale, comes the miller's tale, and then the reeve's tale. And then there's a break. Now, within that chunk, we can say that the order is absolutely important, that the miller's tale gains enormously from being a sort of response and even perhaps a sort of parody of the knight's tale.
And that is obviously significant because there's the same plot structure, two men after the same girl, and how they try to get her, all the stratagems which they use. But the register is totally different. So one is an idealistic picture of love, very philosophical. One is totally pragmatic, totally farcical.
One fixed point, however, is the general prologue, which introduces the Canterbury Tales. It provides a framework for the tales as a whole and sets the scene. It introduces the main themes, the pilgrims, the estates to which they belong, and the tale-telling competition. Chaucer adopts the guise of the naive pilgrim narrator to establish a dual perspective. The innocent narrator is apparently unconscious of the poet's ironic voice.
The prologue is an essential ingredient of the tales because it actually sets a scene in which all the tales can be located. That scene is a scene of pilgrimage. Lots of pilgrims gather at a pub in southern London, and they're going on a pilgrimage to Canterbury, and they decide to pass the time by telling stories competitively.
What the prologue adds is a whole different layer of meaning to the tales, so that you've got the events, the stories about noblemen and ordinary people within the tales, and then you've got reflections of those events in the drama of the tellers.
And it also means that we are encouraged to actually think about the stories evaluatively and even competitively. We are actually encouraged to start trying to work out which story is best. And more important, we're actually being encouraged to think what kind of criteria are appropriate for judging these stories. Are there any criteria which actually encompass the huge variety of these stories?
Chaucer uses the general prologue to subtly introduce his use of satire. This undermines the characters' outward appearances, teaching us not to accept the pilgrims at face value, but to make our own moral judgments.
Chaucer's ironic description of the prioress, for example, reveals her worldly nature.
And silkily she was of great disport, and full pleasant, and amiable of port, and pained her to counterfeit a cheer of court, and been a stachlich of manera, and to ben holden digne of reverence.
A vivid gallery of portraits provides a starting point for our view of the pilgrims, whose lives and tales form the substance of this broad human drama. In the 1300s, a pilgrimage was one of the rare occasions when a cross-section of the community would be gathered together. The tales present a microcosm of society in which a diverse selection of characters interact.
Probably in the 14th century, no group of people with such wide social interests would have gone on a pilgrimage physically together. So I think one would have to say that it's a slanted realism, or perhaps a varied realism. It's building on something real to create something which is a microcosm of the whole, to simplify by bringing them all together in the same place.
They're actually single characters who have been chosen to represent the virtues or the specific vices of a social group. They're actually type characters, if you like, they're stereotypes.
The host of the Tabard Inn, Harry Bailey, who suggested the tale-telling, appoints himself master of ceremonies and persuades the pilgrims to defer to his authority. He arranges the draw to decide who shall tell the first tale. Chaucer muses on the turn of events when the privilege happens to fall to the knight, the highest-ranking pilgrim.
And shortly, for to tellen as it was, were it by aventure or sort or cas, the sooth is this, the cut fell to the knight.
It is uncertain exactly how the 24 stories which constitute the Canterbury Tales were intended to be ordered. However, the 10 manuscript fragments in which they are contained have internal linking passages, as well as some tales whose sequence is clear. Chaucer intended that his narrative should open and close with tales which highlight man's better qualities. These are recited by the idealized knight and parson. Between these boundaries, however, we see the tales encompassing a wide range of popular genre. These vary greatly in style and content, from crude base comedy to courtly love. Each tale is not necessarily meant to stand alone. In many cases, they are designed to heighten a theme or act as a riposte to an earlier tale. The interplay between the Pilgrims' tales reveals more about their characters and also how members of the differing estates viewed each other.
Chaucer was careful to make the tales fit the teller, and some proved to be particularly appropriate. The Wife of Bath's tale, for instance, is a bawdy romance which tells how a woman gains sovereignty within marriage. The Wife of Bath's lusty, comic prologue details her own wide experience of marriage.
Experience, though no nocturity, wherein this world is right enough for me to speak of woe that is in marriage. For, lordings, sith I 12 year was of age, thanked be God that is etern on live, house bondes at church door I have had 5.
The tales are linked by narrative exchanges, which Chaucer uses as a device to cover difficult endings or unfinished works. The Franklin's tale begins when the Franklin interrupts the squire, effectively ensuring that the squire is never required to complete his tale.
I know it well, the Franklin said again. I beg you not to hold me in disdain, just for a word or two to this young man.
Each of the tales, whether completed or not, have an important function. It is clear that whatever their order, Chaucer's intention was that they would work together as a coherent whole in order to provide a commentary on society.
It's hard to say that the tales have different degrees of importance. I think nowadays some of them get read much more than others, get studied much more. Some of the tales seem relatively slight, some of them were left unfinished. Some of the religious tales nowadays seem very dry, very formulaic, quite unappealing to a modern reader. And I suppose there are tales which people uniformly agree to be the great tales. The Knight's Tale, the Miller's, the Wife of Bath's, the Franklin's, the Pardoners. And what is so great about them is that they're superb examples of all their individual genres. And in some cases they're actually the best example of the genre that we have in Middle English.
The Canterbury Tales are part of a tradition of estate satire, a popular literary form in the Middle Ages. Chaucer introduced a cross-section of society into the tales, excluding only the very lowly and the very powerful. The Pilgrims are divided into 3 estates, reflecting the hierarchy of the age: the military, the clergy, and the bourgeoisie. To these groups can be added the pilgrim narrator and the host. The pilgrim's unqualified acceptance of the host's authority sees this diverse social group achieve an artificial form of equality.
You can't put your finger in the prologue upon an extremely rigid social order, an extremely rigid social hierarchy. To some extent, Chaucer is just playing around. He's just mixing all the pilgrims up a little bit. He's actually blurring the strict social boundaries. And he's doing that because actually at the end of the 14th century there was a lot of social confusion, and the upper classes weren't quite as secure as they used to be, and there are lots of nouveau riches who are elbowing in there and they want to be counted in amongst the upper classes. And I think he actually reflects this in a way in which he orders the portraits.
And I suppose Chaucer's other reason for choosing this group, or choosing a majority from this group, is that this introduces the issue of social mobility. The idea that actually although whether you were noble or not was the most important distinction culturally, actually that distinction was breaking down, that you could move from being born a commoner to dying as a noble, and that to us, as far as we're concerned, very slight social mobility, but as far as they're concerned, revolutionary social mobility, was an important feature of England in his time.
Chaucer appears to reinforce social distinctions when the most high-ranking pilgrim, the knight, a member of the military, tells the first tale. Each tale proves to be an expression of the individual pilgrim's personality and moral worth. The knight takes precedence not solely for his rank, but for the respect his idealized figure inspires.
And evermore he had a sovereign price, and though that he were worthy, he was wise, and of his port as meek as his maid. He never yet no villainy ne said in all his life unto no manner wight. He was a very parfit, gentle knight.
Within the tales, social prominence is not necessarily a guarantee of decency. The second estate, the clergy, is shown to encompass not only the idealized, impoverished parson, but also the corrupt friar, a rich libertine. The social milieu of the pilgrimage reflects the changes in late 14th century society. During the tale-telling, the old hierarchical order breaks down when a member of the expanding and increasingly influential bourgeoisie, the miller, displaces a member of the clergy in order to tell the next tale. The bawdy miller's tale parodies the theme of chivalric love, which featured in the knight's tale.
This foolish carpenter was lost in wonder at Nicholas. What could have got him under? He said, "I can't help thinking, by the mass, things can't be going right with Nicholas."
The reeve, infuriated by the miller's treatment of a carpenter in his tale, responds with a derogatory tale of a miller. These tales demonstrate not only an interaction between stories, but also the thematic continuity which shapes the Canterbury Tales.
In thinking about the themes of the Canterbury Tales, I think one should always start from the individual tale. So that, for example, in the Knight's Tale, we have a story about how fate treats two noblemen who seem very similar in lots of ways, but whose life story turns out to be tragically different. And we're forced to ask ourselves, what's the justice of this? How is it that the machinations of the gods can create such suffering for human beings? Having seen that as a theme of the Knight's Tale, then we can see how that theme is played out in a different way in other tales. Tales, for example, which emphasize Christian providence, or tales which treat the idea of justice in a comic way. So for me, one of the big themes of the Canterbury Tales turns out to be the issue of justice and of the meaning of human suffering.
What constitutes nobility? Is it your birth? Is it whom you're descended from? Or is it actually how you behave? Is it a virtue that you show in your behaviour? And this is extremely important in the Clerk's Tale, it's important in the Franklin's Tale, it comes up in the Wife of Bath's Tale. And these are all quite middle-class characters who are out to elevate themselves upon the social scale. So they are all quite keen to prove in their tales that being noble, showing gentillesse, is nothing to do with birth at all. It's actually how you behave which makes all the difference. And of course Chaucer wants to demonstrate that as well. He is a middle-class character who has managed to get himself into the court. So he is very keen to prove that anybody can have all it takes.
The theme of pilgrimage is not just a literary device to enable an exploration of narrative genre. It is a framework from which other major themes of the Canterbury Tales emerge, thrown up by the interaction of a varied social group. Some themes are vehicles for social criticism. Although Christianity provided an accepted structure of social, cultural and religious values, Chaucer judged that the church had become an institution whose spirit was in need of renewal. As representatives of the clergy, the prioress, the monk and the friar are shown to embrace more worldly values.
There are some characters who have deviated so far from piety that they embrace some of the 7 deadly sins. The vices of lust, anger and pride are all evident. However, it is the sin of avarice which produces one of the major themes in the tales, the love of money. Not all Chaucer's themes are serious. He deliberately used differing approaches to alternate the tone and mood of his work. Chaucer took delight in the comic possibilities of human fallibility. In various forms, from humorous tales to the comic disputes between pilgrims, as well as the ironic humour of the poet, comedy permeates the Canterbury Tales.
And certainly, as sure as God is king, to take a wife is a most glorious thing, especially if a man is old and hoary. Then she's the fruit of all his wealth and glory.
Chaucer's a very learned poet, and we of course live in an age which is very remote from the 14th century. So we find that there are many things we have to learn or read or be told in order to understand these poems. But one of the most important things about the poems, in my view, is that for large amounts of the poems, what Chaucer is trying to do is to make us laugh. And so sometimes we're in a very paradoxical position, for example in the Nun's Priest's Tale, when we have to learn lots of different things about medieval dream theory or the medieval approach to astronomy, but that all that Chaucer is trying to do with that information is to make us laugh. So we have to learn and also laugh at the same time. But there's another way in which laughter is very important in Chaucer, I think. It seems to me that one of Chaucer's most characteristic moves is to make you laugh at something, make you think it's ridiculous, and then 10 minutes later show you how serious and important and tragic it is. And it's that mixture between laughing at something and seeing its full import that for me is at the heart of Chaucer's achievement.
As a single narrative work, the Canterbury Tales is one of the greatest long English poems. Chaucer's work, like almost all medieval literature, was intended to be read aloud. Its sound patterns are those of a work designed for an oral delivery.
They had a cook with them who stood alone for boiling chicken with a marrow bone, sharp flavouring powder and a spice for savour. He could distinguish London ale by flavour, and he could roast and seethe and broil and fry, make good thick soup and bake a tasty pie. But what a pity, so it seemed to me, that he should have an ulcer on his knee.
The pilgrim narrator in the general prologue is not sharing his experience with an individual reader. He is addressing himself to an audience. In the Middle Ages, in the absence of written literature, popular cultural memory depended on a strong oral tradition. In a period when literacy was rare, reading was not an individual pursuit, it was a performance art. As a court poet, Chaucer's primary audience for the oral presentation of his work would have ranged from nobles to servants. The Canterbury Tales, with its naturalistic style of dialogue and cross-section of characters, would have required an element of theatricality from its narrator to which the audience could respond.
In his earlier works, Chaucer had been an experimental poet. He had been reading the latest work of the French and Italian poets and thinking about how that related to the Roman poetry that he knew better. He was a very intellectual poet, very experimental poet. He was one of the first poets to consciously imitate Dante's Divine Comedy.
When he moves to his mature poetry like Troilus and Crusade and the Canterbury Tales, he starts using a 5-stress line. And this is actually, it's a rarity, it was done very little before him. It actually gives you a longer line in which you can say more complicated things and in which you can be more sophisticated in your ideas, in which you can actually fit more material. And I think that assists in the complexity of his mature poetry. And where he is really, really innovative is that he takes these five stress lines and he orders them in rhyming couplets. And that gives you a very fluid, very flexible metre, which is particularly useful for writing extended narrative verse.
In the latter part of the 14th century, a gradual advance in literacy, which had been the preserve of the clergy, saw the emergence of educated laymen like Chaucer, who recorded their narratives on manuscripts. The age of print initiated a process in which printing technology continually evolved and improved, ensuring that 600 years after his death, copies of Chaucer's work continue to be reproduced either in Middle English or in translation.
History Hit is a streaming platform that is just for history fans, with fantastic documentaries covering fascinating figures and moments in history from all over the world. We aim to bring you only the most dramatic and fascinating stories of the past through our award-winning documentaries. Find out about the rise of leaders such as Cleopatra and Napoleon in our latest offering of exclusive documentaries. Sign up now for a free trial, and Perspective fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code PERSPECTIVE at checkout.
To the modern reader, the unfamiliar appearance of Middle English with its non-standardized pronunciation and spelling can be problematical. Chaucer wrote and spoke in the Middle English dialect, which had become the accepted language of the court. This is the language of the Canterbury Tales, and it is from this form that much modern English descends. Chaucer was the first major writer to combine the English language with continental forms of rhyme and metre. In order to understand the linguistic effects achieved by his sound patterns and rhyme, the importance of the oral tradition cannot be overemphasized. Chaucer's verse is primarily intended to be spoken aloud.
Chaucer's original plan for the Canterbury Tales was that each pilgrim would tell 4 stories, which would allow an exploration of various narrative forms. It may be that Chaucer revised his plan or simply ran out of time. Whatever the reason, the scheme did not reach fruition. There are only 24 tales, and the collection ends before the pilgrims reach Canterbury.
We have to remember that Chaucer always had tremendous problems with endings. Many of his works are unfinished, and in many of his other works, when he gets near the ending, you can feel him becoming nervous. At the end of Troilus and Cressida, his greatest finished work, he suddenly addresses the ladies and apologizes to them for Cressida's infidelity and promises to tell stories about men's infidelity in the future. Then he has another thought, and he decides that really the whole story wasn't about men and women, but was about the relationship of the soul to fate. Chaucer gets very nervous at the end of a work, because I think he feels that at the end of a work, his options are running out. The ending of the work will determine what a work means. And once the audience has decided what a work means, the audience will feel free to criticize the author. The audience is no longer held in thrall by the storyteller's spell. So that whatever Chaucer's original plan was, I think it was modified by his fear of reaching a definite ending, as well as, of course, by life simply running out on him.
Despite the unfinished nature of the work, there is an overarching design to the tales. Using various narrative forms, Chaucer, while engaging with social reality, weighed the morality of his characters, laying bare their excesses. His final story is told by a truly good man. The Parson's Tale is a sermon on the Christian theme of penitence, which finally accords with the true spirit of pilgrimage. The Parson's prologue deals with its content.
The parson said at once in level tones, "You'll get no fable or romance from me, For Paul, in his epistle to Timothy, reproves all those who wave aside the truth for fables that are wretched and uncouth.
When I think about which tale is it that makes me think the longest, which tale is it that raises the biggest issues, then I think it's probably The Knight's Tale. Though there are times when the Franklin's Tale makes me think almost as hard. But if you ask me which tale I enjoy the most, which tale has the most intricate balance between thought and humour, then I think I'd give the prize to The Miller's Tale.
On a personal level, I think The Merchant's Tale is actually my favourite. And it's my favourite because whereas all the other tales actually stick to one kind of narrative, they're either romances or they're fabliaux or whatever, The Merchant's Tale is this kind of fantastic hybrid which manages to be a romance, a fabliaux, a bit of an epic, introduce a few moments of classicism, all stuffed into the same tale. It's the tale which wants to do everything and which manages to be cynical about everything in the same breath. And I think it's a great tale.